September 15, 1959. Nikita S. Khrushchev, chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, arrives in Washington with his official party. Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the United States, welcomes his guest. U.S. Secretary of State and Mrs. Christian Herter head the receiving line that greets Mr. Khrushchev. As the guard of honor comes to attention, a 21-gun salute sounds over the field. Mr. Eisenhower offers these words of greeting.
Mr. Chairman, I welcome you, your family, and party to the United States. I am especially happy that Mrs. Khrushchev and other members of your family are accompanying you. On behalf of the government and of the people of America, I express the hope that you and they will find your stay among us interesting and useful. I am looking forward to the talks we will have together. Although we shall not be negotiating any issues affecting the interests of other countries, I trust that a full and frank exchange of views on many subjects may contribute to better understanding on both sides of unresolved international questions.
Mr. Khrushchev replies.
Господин президент, дамы и господа,
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, permit me at this moment, in first setting foot on American soil, to thank Mr. Eisenhower for the invitation to visit your country, and everyone present for the warm welcome accorded us representatives of the Soviet Union. Russians say every good job should be started in the morning. Our flight began in Moscow this morning, and we now have the pleasure of first meeting you on American soil on the morning of the same day. As you see, our countries are not so distant from each other. Mrs. Khrushchev now joins her husband and the President of the United States as they prepare to drive into the city. Washington, curious crowds, among the largest ever to greet a foreign visitor, line the wide avenues of the capital. The President's guest house, across from the White House, is to be the Khrushchev's home while they are in Washington. few hours later, Chairman Khrushchev crosses the street to the White House. He is accompanied by U.S. Ambassador Lodge, who is to be his official guide during his American journey. Inside the President's office, a memento of the Soviet Union's historic moonshot is presented to Mr. Eisenhower. Vice President Nixon, the United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union Thompson, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko, and Soviet Ambassador to the United States Menshikov are also present on this occasion. The official program is slightly altered. On a friendly impulse, President Eisenhower has ordered a helicopter to come to the White House lawn. He wishes to give Mr. Khrushchev a personal tour above the capital city of the United States. Their flight affords them a splendid view of the city and its monuments to the leaders of the American Revolution. The one to George Washington towers 555 feet high. Thomas Jefferson's Memorial. Below is the Capitol building. They fly along the Potomac River. They see highways from their aerial platform. And residential areas that surround the city. Here is one of the many suburban shopping centers. The city is quiet on this late summer afternoon. At the White House, Mr. and Mrs. Khrushchev are entertained by Mr. and Mrs. Eisenhower during their first night in Washington. They are the guests of honor at a state dinner. Next morning, early rising Washingtonians get a glimpse of the distinguished visitor. Mr. Khrushchev steps out of the President's guest house for a taste of morning air and greets the passers-by from the portico. First stop this morning is Beltsville, the research center of the United States Department of Agriculture. Here, the Soviet Premier is warmly welcomed by Secretary of Agriculture Benson. Later, Mr. Khrushchev will see the more practical aspects of agriculture. Today, the emphasis is on science and its role in improving the American nation's food supply. The visitor sees several demonstrations on the promotion and inhibition of plant growth by special pigments, on the use of highly selective weed killers that do not harm cereal crops or legumes, and the results of growth-regulating chemicals on grains, fruits, and trees. Outside, Mr. Khrushchev views one of the farm's prize dairy herds. One of the practices in America that has greatly increased milk production is the keeping of careful records by individual farmers, the better to cull low-producing cows. The Beltsville small white turkey was developed at this station. Designed for small families, this breed matures faster than others, converting feed into meat more efficiently. This is what you get for being so rich and fat, laughs Mr. Khrushchev. Now you start looking for small turkeys. We like big turkeys in the Soviet Union. But anyway, the more turkeys we have, the better off we all will be. Back in Washington, the National Press Club awaits Mr. Khrushchev as a luncheon speaker. Before a packed gathering of 600 leading journalists and a nationwide television audience numbering in the millions, Mr. Khrushchev discusses the general objectives of his American journey and expresses his satisfaction with what he has seen so far. I have been asked what results may be expected from our visit. It is only yesterday that we arrived in the capital of the United States. It would be premature to try to anticipate the results of our visit. Indeed, even the weatherman has great difficulty in forecasting the weather for only a day ahead. And forecasts in politics are certainly no less difficult. However, if one is to judge by the first day of our meetings and talks in Washington, I should say that the barometer shows fine. Following an hour and 40 minutes of speaking and answering the questions of the assembled journalists, Mr. Khrushchev makes a sightseeing tour of the city. He discusses foreign affairs at the Capitol with leading senators and congressmen, and he views the memorials to past American presidents. The most important to him is that which enshrines the spirit of Abraham Lincoln. To this memorial, he comes with his official party to pay honor to Lincoln as a fighter for freedom. The Soviet embassy in Washington next becomes the center of attention. Mr. and Mrs. Khrushchev give a formal banquet this evening. American pianist Van Cliburn is one of the guests. United States Vice President and Mrs. Nixon arrive. President and Mrs. Eisenhower also join the Khrushchevs. The Eisenhower's daughter-in-law and son John are present too. Next morning, a railroad train bears Mr. Khrushchev north toward New York City. Across rivers and past farmland and factories, this ride is the first leg of his American journey. Ambassadors Thompson, Lodge, and Menshikov are with him as the train rushes through the countryside, past towns and their marketplaces. This is Newark, a smaller city near New York. Mr. Khrushchev waves to people along the way. Greetings are exchanged from window to window. In New York, long before he even arrives, throngs fill the streets to see Mr. Khrushchev when his motorcade rolls through the city. This is indeed an historic visit, the first ever made by a Soviet premier to this country. During his stay in New York, Mr. Khrushchev speaks at two large public events. One of these is the mayor's luncheon, at which he tells his American audience, "I am convinced that you do not want war, neither with our country nor any other. Let us then come to an agreement on how to preserve eternal peace. Let us have more contacts between our countries. We are for cooperation between our countries and all countries." Later, Governor Rockefeller, whose family is well known as a symbol of American capitalism, welcomes him on behalf of the people of New York State. North of the city at Hyde Park, the late President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is buried. Paying solemn tribute to his memory, Mr. and Mrs. Khrushchev walked to his tomb with Mr. Roosevelt's widow. The Soviet leader places a wreath. It reads, "To an outstanding statesman of the United States of America, a great champion of progress and peace." Now, the United Nations headquarters in New York City awaits the arrival of Mr. Khrushchev. To this world institution, also dedicated to the ideals of progress and peace, he comes to make an important speech. Just inside the door, Mr. Khrushchev is greeted by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. Accompanied by President Victor Belaúnde of the General Assembly, Mr. Khrushchev receives a warm welcome from delegates representing more than 80 countries. In his formal address to the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Khrushchev concentrates on the burning issue of disarmament.
Что предлагает советское правительство?
What does a Soviet government propose?
Суть наших предложений состоит в том,
The essence of all proposals is that over a period of 4 years, all states should effect complete disarmament and should no longer have any means of waging war.
разоружение и не имели больше средств ведения войны. Это означает,
The speaker calls for elimination of all armed forces, military bases and institutions, military rockets and thermonuclear weapons. He proposes that there should remain only strictly limited contingents of police or militia, armed only with small arms.
хочу заверить делегатов Генеральной Ассамблеи, что в лице Советского Союза Организация Объединенных Наций будет иметь и
I wish to assure the delegates to the General Assembly that in the Soviet Union, the United Nations will continue to have the most active participant in all efforts aimed at releasing mankind from the burden of armaments and consolidating peace throughout the world.
Спасибо, господа, за внимание. Спасибо.
Outside, following a tour of the United Nations buildings, Mr. Khrushchev and his party drive off for other engagements to see more of the city of New York. Auspiciously, good weather accompanies them everywhere. From the top of the Empire State Building, tallest in the world, this is their view of America's largest city. Millions of tourists, like themselves, have enjoyed this lofty look from the observation platform on the 102nd floor. Looking north and west, one sees the shipping in the Hudson River. Antennas on this tower transmit television to 15 million viewers in the city and its suburbs. His 2-day visit to New York over, Chairman Khrushchev flies 3,000 miles across the United States to Los Angeles. 3 jet passenger planes of the American Air Force have been placed at the disposal of Mr. Khrushchev and his official party by President Eisenhower. These are the same type of aircraft used by U.S. commercial airlines. First to greet Mr. and Mrs. Khrushchev as they disembark is the mayor of Los Angeles. Following their welcome at the airport, the Soviet guests briefly tour the city. Los Angeles, which lies in the southwest corner of America in the state of California, is the nation's 3rd largest community. It was settled originally by Spanish-speaking peoples. Today, its varied industries, mild climate, and large residential areas are what most strike the visitor. The Los Angeles suburb Hollywood is the famous motion picture center. Here, Mr. Khrushchev and his entourage are met by Mr. Skouras, president of one of the major U.S. filmmaking firms. Motion picture executive Eric Johnston introduces them to leaders of the Hollywood community. Inside, they view a sequence of a motion picture as it's being filmed. Both Mr. Khrushchev and his hosts voice the hope that there will be an increasingly greater exchange of American and Soviet films. Next day, Mr. Khrushchev takes a train trip north toward the city of San Francisco. He is delighted at this stage of his journey with the opportunity of seeing and being seen by many more American people. Crowds gather at every station along his route. During the train ride, Mr. Khrushchev gets better acquainted with the 300 American newsmen and women who are covering his trip. California is a fertile land which has blossomed under irrigation and care. The train runs close to the Pacific Ocean on the western side. At last, his train pulls into San Francisco. An amusing incident occurs when Mr. Khrushchev learns that San Francisco's Mayor Christopher is running for re-election to political office. "I am a good campaigner," he tells the city's top official. "Do you want me to campaign for you?" Mr. Khrushchev is highly pleased with the city of San Francisco. Its citizens are delighted when he asserts that this is one of the most beautiful cities he has seen in America. From his hotel room, the Soviet premier has a splendid view of the town and harbor. San Francisco and Vladivostok, he declares, are both windows on the Pacific, and he expresses the wish that trade between them may grow. A factory in the nearby city of San Jose is on the itinerary. This plant manufactures electronic machines. It produces the IBM Raymac computers, 3 of which were exhibited last summer at the American National Exhibition in Moscow. Mr. Khrushchev is greeted by the company's president, Mr. Watson, and he takes much pleasure in touring the factory and in meeting and talking with various employees. He tells his hosts, "There is no doubt that American capitalism has given the American people a great deal, including the highest living standards in the world." But he goes on to say that in the future, the Soviet people will do even better and attain an even higher standard of living. This peaceful competition, he adds, should not interfere with the establishment of good relations between our two countries. From San Francisco, Mr. Khrushchev flies to Des Moines, Iowa, a city in the center of the United States. Here, the great interest of the American people in their Soviet visitor is clearly evident. All around Des Moines one sees magnificent farmland. This region is called the Corn Belt of the United States. In few places has agriculture been raised to so high a level. Mr. Khrushchev has long wished to see this area for himself. To do so, he goes to the Iowa home of a longtime American friend and farmer, Roswell Garst, who is widely known for his advanced views on modern farm techniques. The formula here is land plus corn plus livestock. Three factors make its great productivity possible. The first of these is technology, new plants and hybrids, fertilizers, insecticides, and weed killers. The second is mechanization, the most efficient machines that can be devised. The third is management and planning. In all three, American farmers seek to excel. Mr. Garst shows Mr. Khrushchev one of his trench silos. Years ago, they stored this fodder in upright silos. Now they pack it into huge pits, where it keeps just as well, and a lot less expensively. What used to take many men several hours is now accomplished in a few minutes. Here, tons of yellow corn are quickly moved to storage chambers. On American farms, mechanization is so common that only 12% of the people produce food for all of the people. This region also produces fine cattle and hogs. Mr. Garst seeks more and better food for the people of the world. In this, both he and his Soviet guests heartily concur. While their husbands are looking at farm and feedlot, Mrs. Garst and Mrs. Khrushchev talk about womanly matters. They graciously yield to the pleas of cameramen to pose for their portrait. Amid the press of newsmen, there's a conference with Adlai Stevenson at left, a political leader. The Iowans and the Khrushchevs get along well together. One of Mr. Garst's grandsons steps up for a handshake. From Des Moines, the Soviet premier flies to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. An inland port on the Ohio River, this city is the world's largest producer of steel, aluminum, and glass. It is also a leader in the making of machine tools. Thousands of its people wish to see Mr. Khrushchev. Though it's early in the morning, huge crowds gather around the hotel that is headquarters for the Soviet visitors. Chairman Khrushchev, remarkably hale and hearty after his strenuous tour, acknowledges their welcome. On a drive through the city, more thousands have the opportunity of seeing the Soviet leader. City officials call this the biggest outpouring of people in Pittsburgh's history. The tour passes one of the many open hearth furnaces. This industrial landscape evokes strong memories, Mr. Khrushchev declares, of his youth in the Donetsk coal basin. The Soviet premier stops at one of the plants that makes machine tools for the steel industry. Work pauses while Mr. Khrushchev is shown through the factory. He impresses both the workers and the plant managers with his knowledge of their industry. From Pittsburgh, Mr. Khrushchev flies back to Washington. He returns to the capital city from which his American journey began. Behind him are busy days of traveling and constantly meeting people. Ahead are a few days of private conversations with President Eisenhower. Here he arrives at the White House, the official residence of the Chief Executive of the United States. place for the important meetings between Chairman Khrushchev and President Eisenhower is not Washington, however, but rather Mr. Eisenhower's country retreat some few miles away at Camp-Дэвид, Maryland. Once more, the two men share a helicopter, for it is simplest to make the brief trip to Camp-Дэвид by air and by car. This type of flying machine is useful for short hops. Though a host of newsmen covers their arrival at Camp-Дэвид, their subsequent hours and conversations here are private ones. Their talks are not undertaken to negotiate issues, but rather with the hope that their exchanges of views will contribute to a better understanding of the motives and positions of each, and thus to the achievement of a just and lasting peace. The two leaders agree that all outstanding international questions should be settled not by the application of force, but by peaceful means, through negotiation. Finally, it is agreed that the President will make a return visit to the Soviet Union next spring. Later at Blair House, their meetings over, the President bids farewell to his Soviet guest at his temporary home in America. Perhaps the essence of their meeting is best expressed by Mr. Khrushchev on his return to the Soviet Union, when he describes President Eisenhower as a person who enjoys the full confidence of his people and who is exerting all his efforts in the interests of peace.